Hello everyone, today we talk about the Romano-Germanic military system. We already made some of these introductory videos about the 6th, 7th century in the Latin Germanic West, and we have already highlighted as a consequence the sort of political, social, religious foundations of this system. I will not, of course, digress much on the same as a further introduction. Today we look at some other aspects of the world, that is to say, a bit more like the ideological one, even on the basis of onomastics. That is to say, who were the people who came to rule these territories that established this powerful realms that at the end of the day are at the base of also today's Western European political states at large, of course, on previous bases in Roman and also pre-Roman times. But that consolidated in a fashion that is still somehow very deeply connected with our way of identifying, of sort of feeling for certain things. And of course, this is a broader topic that we'll have to address in so many different videos, but it's important to enucleate, contextualizing it to the actual purpose and drive that people had. Naturally, the 6th and the 7th century alike are different from one another. They fundamentally and respectively witnessed this great sort of consolidation, even expansional phases in the first half of the 6th especially, and a moment of essentially exhaustion, of final settlement and territorial definition, a bit because of the Justinian plague of the second half of the 6th century, but also because of the quite intense warfare that had been going on for centuries, that in part you can make the case having set the same preconditions for this exhaustion, this shrinking. I made videos about the Justinian era, also as far as the plague is concerned, from the Byzantine side of the Isle and beyond. But you know that this is, and we discussed even this recently, like a pretty transversal phenomenon all across Eurasia, all across world civilizations, that brings to a final redefinition, especially in the West during the 7th century, of this system within a unique spiritual temper. The 7th century is fundamentally one of the definitive Catholicization of the Latin Germanic West, even before Christianization, meaning that, of course, regardless also of the, this case, Germanically wise, the Vodanic cult, the fact that these nations would see themselves as part of a broader Catholic system at the end of antiquity and beyond is not to be given for granted, right? Most of this, of course, is achieved thanks to the more important centers of power in this regard. The military one, you can make this sort of dual differentiation, even though everything is much more homogeneous in between and beyond. The military center of the Franks, of the Merovingian Empire, in Rome as probably the heart of the European sacred and spiritual power and force. So I also recently created playlists for the 6th, the 7th century, so we will try to cover the entire chronological spectrum touched by Schwerpunkt with these boxes, so you can sort of frame, if you're very interested in a very specific moment, a very specific century, you can sort of focus on it through it, because the objective on Schwerpunkt, especially when say series playlists are outlined, is exactly to give that overall sense of what was going on, the vibe, the temper of the times, and generally speaking, the meaning, the beliefs that these peoples had. And so some of my more successful videos are dedicated to these very topics. There is one about the Germanic imperial Catholic miracle that a couple of months ago really got a lot of views and procured me a lot of subscriptions. That explains a big deal that we will see it further in other videos. Nevertheless, it's important, in order to stress the success of the Catholic enterprise and belief, to observe how corporative it was. So, of course, the differences between the various chunks constituting the Latin Germanic West. And so, looking at this from a military point of view, is quite helpful for the aforementioned political and social, religious, sort of omnicomprehensive perspectives. And the differences are cool because at the end of the day, there are some similar fundamentals, right? A pre-existent Roman rule, some unavoidable Christianization and, say, acculturation of these peoples. Accordingly, the coexistence with the previous elites, the power sharing, the blending into that by different degrees, but still. And then the Germanic superimposition and this, essentially this totalization and publicization, even though it's not technically the best term, of power in these former provinces and very center, beating heart of the Roman Empire of Latinity, right? That brings to a quite unique blend of tradition and modernity for the times being that will be really the sub for a great success in the following centuries. And we can realize how, of course, each and every one of these peoples, for whom I also made individually, like the episodes of a broader series about the migration era peoples, that's called, you can search for, is visible, is understandable throughout all the period, starting from the first half of the 5th century, when the Visigoths in particular settled in Aquitaine, and followed by all different populations that do similar but not quite identical things. And so this variation is interesting to characterize better the internal dynamics, understanding why only some of these countries would make it. Say the Visigoths, the Vandals do not make it. Others are, say, incorporated within the broader Frankish Empire in Carolingian times. Others remain pretty much on their own, with quite interesting features like the Anglo-Saxons. So a basic distinction can be made of those peoples that settled in a relatively uninhabited desertum, as the Romans would have called. This is especially true for the invaders of Britain, that is to say the Angles, the Jutes, the Saxons, or also the Alemanni, in at least areas in which the Roman presence had been more feeble or had enfeebled over time. This is true for the Bavaria as well, for the Thuringi. We made videos about these all. Another group is the one that instead dominated regions, the inhabitants of which were just massively prevalent. There could not be even just prompted to move in some way. You know that, for example, in Britain there is an important shift, at least of the elites, towards the west, and even to the west of the island, or even to Brittany. Indeed, southwestern Europe is still the by far more developed part of the continent. Romanity has been fundamentally going on, and if anything, a more characteristic regional path, in fact, on the basis also of the different Germanic peoples that settled in there, but had already, again, had an importantly separate provincial identity throughout all Roman history. But here, basically, the German settlement happens on the scale of several tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds, a few hundreds of thousands, in essentially pools of millions. And so you understand that in spite of the important, say, of this injection that is very much strategic in nature, these are more militarized peoples, they tend also to settle, especially in this part, in the actually less appealing, sometimes, but more strategically relevant areas, also the least Romanized to an extent as well. The conquerors are quite more quickly Romanized, right? And they rule largely on more civilized places that they contribute also to keep functioning along the Roman basis. This is the case, of course, of the Burgundians, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths, right? Then it also depends on who we want to include to an extent. For example, the Suebi that go to essentially northern Portugal, northwestern Spain, do not. That was actually a very fringe area already, even in a Roman land, are eventually absorbed by the Visigoths. There are some surely Suebic. There is some Suebic legacy in loco, but they do not. This people does not go on as an autonomous political reality. The Vandals settle actually in a pretty good spot. That is, at least for piracy, for raiding, for infesting the central Mediterranean. But exactly for this, they always have the Damocles sword of, first of all, whoever is ruling in Italy, that, like the Ostrogoths, that dislodge them from Sicily and keep them at bay. The Vandals are pretty stubborn people, and they're finally wiped out by the Byzantines, were some of the single most influential peoples in determining the end of the Western Roman Empire, at least in sort of blocking great part of the grain supplies that historically had been established from Africa to Italy. This is especially the time of Gaiseric. Then you have the Longobards that indeed are often seen as this peak of barbarism and of sort of intolerance even towards the Romans and the Catholics, and that instead turn out to be exactly the opposite in actual historiographical research, and that, albeit and indeed maintaining a greater sense of Germanness compared to this more heavily Romanized Burgundians, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths, and even the Franks that do compromise with Roman power, manage to establish essentially the single most civilly advanced power in Latin Germanic Europe. Not the strongest military-wise, but definitely the most literate, the most urbanized, the one in which the same Germanic dukes basically learn how to read, to write. They're very invested in justice, in attending trials and so on. Is a very strong public authority in Longobard Italy. That, of course, is also very much a Roman legacy, because it is true that the Longobards had not, before the migration, much had to do with the Romans, if not in very sort of peripheral areas like Pannonia. Then you have the Franks, that are by far the most important system, which is very connected, much more connected than we think with Italy, as we pointed out at the beginning, because the Romano-Frankish connubium does not start with Charlemagne. It starts very much earlier. In fact, at the time of the same Clovis, that not just, in fact, Christianizes, passing directly from the so-called, say, let's not call even paganism, because he detested paganism, let's say Bodanism, the Bodanic cult, into the probably to the fullest Catholic, non-Arian Christianity, and does so by structuring the single most hierarchically imperial system in the entire Europe, was the strongest one, exactly because basically the Frankish nobility simply united with the Gallo-Roman one, and this massive power sharing maintained this higher form of rule that in Gaul had always existed since late antiquity, the powerful Roman latifundia, and so extends to a degree that is, in fact, imperial in nature and in character, of course, even before Charlemagne, and that does also aspire to some kind of role within the empire, because all these powers believe in Catholicism, of course, because they believe in Romanity, which is something that people hardly understand in the deepest metaphysical sense what it is. That's why I made countless videos on tradition to explain what that meant. Clovis receives the imperial vicariate for the Gauls from the Byzantine emperor. There are similarities, especially with the Ostrogoths, right? But indeed, when you look at Latin Germanic Europe, especially because at least the Vandals are gone relatively early, you see a incredibly coherent system that, in spite of the general international exhaustion, starts tying together, especially from a spiritual point of view, in the axis constituted by Italy, Gaul, Anglo-Saxon Britain, and the same Celtic fringe that had largely remained out of the Roman Empire, which is a very beautiful exception that you can point out. I say Gaul, actually, the Frankish system that includes the VI-VII, the part of whoever falls under their control, eventually the Thuringians, the Frisians, etc. And it all depends also on the limits of this power. But generally speaking, this force remains concentrated in post-Roman Europe, so that we really look at a Romano-Germanic capacity. The Franks had settled also in this imperially facilitating fashion, as in some parts of northern Gaul, in spite of overall they were, not the majority in the region, the Franks really surpass for vast swaths of communities like the St. Romance population, right? Then you have a central and southern Gaul, especially the latter remains heavily Romanized, and not only in part also under the control of the Visigoths, right, in the far southwest. There are the Burgundians too that are incorporated, and that are essentially the only people that virtually becomes Frankish, right? Entirely, like what you think of the French in a broader sense is the product, and I made a video about this that witnesses the absorption of the Burgundians, differently from the Aquitanians or the Alemanni, into properly the Frankish nation as a whole. This is especially true from upper Burgundy towards further north. There is a greater agglutination, part on the basis of the previous Gallia Belgica. All right. But this dynamic is quite interesting, right? Because from northern France, there is still somehow particularly Romanized. We tend to perhaps underestimate a bit too much how well ordered Belgica had been in Roman times, especially to foster a military efficiencies, a self-sufficiency, controlling the Rhine frontier. And how much the Franks, of course, capitalize on this by militarizing their elites further through a veritable elite system, whereby basically the entire power is held by very few people that, however, make war like crazy because they have this enormous sort of professional collective capacity. And that's where essentially Carolingian cavalry and the entire Western one in a feudal sense will stem from. Then you have, again, another criterion you could use to evaluate these peoples, in a sense, because just a few will remain. At the end of the day, the only players are remaining standing are the Longobards, the Franks, and the Anglo-Saxons. Right, the others, in one way or another, are either knocked out or absorbed by the others, and in fact, we don't have to digress to post-Carolingian time, because there you have further institutionalization, that you have the Longobard kingdom becoming the Italic one, you have other, which is really just in part the exception, at least from before the partitions of the same Carolingian Empire. You have the Anglo-Saxons developing essentially a kingdom on its own, as you know well. But when you look at and there are issues also with the Franks that at time are fragmented, into 4 large chunks. But at the end of the day, they do remain pretty cohesive because of that gluing capacity that France always have, with that fracturing then coming back together, which we can't simply digress on now. But that does have to do with that elite mechanism that we were talking about before. You have the Burgundians being absorbed, just say, by the Franks. But also that counts as somebody essentially ceasing to exist, at least as an independent policy. We are in southeastern Gaul. The Vandals in Africa are knocked out by Belisarius. The Ostrogoths of Italy too. And these will be, we already said it, the Visigoths are crushed by the Arabs, right? And the Longobards are, if anything, just absorbed by Charlemagne, that takes on their distinctive crown next to the Frankish one. It's not absorbed, it remains a thing on its own. So you can argue that the people lives on in the Italic kingdom. So these powers, as you understand, belong to some different time, era each. Like some have continuous histories, other really do not last on the longer run. In a strictly national sense, you can argue that the name of the Franks and also the one of the English are the more preserved in a political and national sense, to a very interesting end. That is to say that these countries actually look very similar by, say, the 12th century, if anything, because also the English have been conquered by the Normans, that are Western Franks in everything. But that, let's say, old unity, right, historically speaking, probably does contribute to the foundation of the more successful kingdoms in the West, England and France, in a strictly monarchic and national sense, right? Think about also in the later Middle Ages, the nation states and so on. You can look at other criteria. One is the degree of expansion or settlement after they had fundamentally stabilized in their political territorial fundamentals. For example, the Ostrogoths were a pretty enterprising people. They, as you know, ransomed Sicily from the Vandals. We were saying before, they controlled, actually beyond their de facto Italic kingdom, up to the Danube, like into Germany, and up to Singidunum, still on the Danube, of course, but in basically at the boundary between Central Europe and the Balkans. So the entire Illyricum included. They expand into Provence. They basically establish some sort of overlordship over the same Visigoths during a time of minority of the local king, because in part also the common Gothic and Arian background. At the same time, this power crumbles, not before like more than one fight, actually, when the Byzantines invade Italy. The Vandals are basically knocked out immediately without too much problem. Made a bit about the Battle of Tricamarum a couple of months ago. If you're interested, we'll keep covering Belisarius' enterprises. The Franks are definitely the more far-reaching people of this, at least north of the Alps, they do establish like a properly continental system of hierarchy and leadership that does take on, as we were saying, an imperial character. The Ostrogoths did not have that really. They worked a bit more on a Roman basis, right, than a sort of feudal Germanic one, if you want. So we said it, like the Aquitanians, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, the Bavarians, the Thuringians, etc. They all fall under the Frankish hegemony that at some point is halted only by their internal fragmentation, and not because they wouldn't come back knocking at the Mediterranean, especially pointing to Rome, and they're also contending its control from the Byzantines in a broader universal scheme. The Longobards basically settle into Italy. They realize that that's their stage, and they gradually succeed in ousting the Byzantines almost completely from the peninsula before the Franks arrive. And it's more like a cultural victory to begin with than a strictly military one, because yes, they win also strategically, they have the upper hand, but it's really the model, that Latin Germanic, not the Greco-Byzantine one, that succeeded. Also in this cradle of Romanity, of Italicness to begin with, that also the Longobards contribute to define into some sort of more Italian way. So much could be said, of course, individually about all these things. I have made really lots of videos about all these peoples, and we'll have to make many more. Right? Recently I made an interview, I told you here and there, and I was asked, like, the first question, you will see that because it's going to come out in a couple of weeks, I think. Like, why do you talk so much about early medieval Europe, the migration era? Well, I actually don't. Right? I wish I could talk much more about that. If you look about the incidence of this topic on all the videos that I made, like, it's not even that high, but for some reason this sticks more. At least I tend to be associated to it for some reason. In the 6th and in the 7th century, you understand, why did we talk about this as a premise to the video? Because, of course, we don't even have to go specifically anywhere with it. These are very well known, like, basic stories and characteristics of these Romano-Germanic kingdoms. But, of course, each one of them developed a different military history. This is evident. We already hinted at that. Like, the Franks developed this essentially professional military system based on feudal clienteles, for which just one guy is really a complete force of nature, especially when fighting with the others, because they have enough resources to spend in order to train repeatedly at that level, whereas all the rest of the population works for them. That's why France is what it is. Then you have other systems. This is very similar to the Visigoths, except, of course, in part they were more Romanized. They had a bit less feudal bias. But in any case, they're wiped out by the Arabs, so it's not like we know that much. The Anglo-Saxons, how could have evolved? But the Visigoths were praised for being good horsemen by the same Franks. By the 8th century, there was a bit also this leaving of sort of migration era legions, because of course the Franks stemmed just like from the forests of Western Germany. They were, except for the northern Germans, the people that made the least use of cavalry. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Longobards, they all had some much more prominent steppe features, like a quite powerful injection of Iranian elements as well. They were in Francia too. We have seen it with the Alans in Gaul. That there was also a thing. That is true for all of these peoples. However, the Franks developed this more like as a sort of social engineering, and at least what the Gallo-Roman society lent itself for. The Anglo-Saxons and the Longobards have a much more, say, egalitarian system. At least their per capita wealth, even though quite varying, because the Anglo-Saxons definitely are not rich as the Longobards, but it's much more evenly distributed. And so there is a more traditional Romano-Germanic system rather than sort of a later feudal one. Of course, there is some superimposition. There is a general tendency. I explained this, made a video about, for example, the chivalric nature of the Thane, right? Even though the Anglo-Saxons, as a meme, were not at least particularly famous for being strong cavalrymen, but they did have, of course, a lot of horsemanship and ideally that sense of equestrian heroism into that in the very relations between freemen. And this is true for the Longobards as well, but their armies are more, especially the Anglo-Saxon ones, are infantry-based. The Longobards do have, of course, cavalry, but they're basically identical to the Franks, except that again they have less professional elements within the army as a whole because their society is not a feudal one, right? And that's why the Franks basically steamroll everybody in the process. Also, even after sort of the migration era, the same goes for the Normans at Hastings and the spread properly of Western Frankish feudalism that stems from this Franco-Roman and Latin Germanic blend, really, as a whole. And so you understand, even from this, that there are different military histories. There are sort of more primitive systems in general. For example, what would become Germany as an eastern frontier, the Merovingian world, is much more primal and sort of, basic. Like, there are important changes during the migration era in all these places. Fundamentally, the aristocracies went up at the expense of the freemen. This is even more pronounced north of the Alps, where you would think that, in fact, that was more like a tradition. Instead, no, like there was no public statal culture to sort of absorb that system. The Longobards instead do pretty well, and that's why also they are more civilized of these all. Not even the Visigoths really managed that. Like Spain, like Gaul, had largely maintained the latifundium system from Roman times, and so that served the establishment of large nobiliar powers that at some point were not even that useful for the integrity and the stability of the kingdom, but they were gradually building up the same on it. There are all different shades depending on what times and places we're discussing. For example, the Visigoths already had from the previous Iberian tradition, from which also the Arabs owe much, like this lighter cavalry, the skirmishes, hit and run tactics that are pretty fitting, like the mesetas and these vast plains in between the hilltops and so on. You have different frontier areas, like the Longobards bordered the Avars, the Anglo-Saxons, the Celts. You have like the most feudally developed Franks that clash against the Saxons that are instead sort of more hardcore, sort of basic Germanic primitive systems, even though they're actually very close, right? They're like cousins, ethnically speaking, like especially the Austrasians are very, very similar to the Saxons. It's difficult to even separate them. And Charlemagne, the Carolingians, were from those places, Cologne, the Rhine, etc. We've seen in other videos, of course, the continuity with the Roman system as well, especially up to the mid-6th century is very much of a thing. There are Roman troops, like entire units. Procopius famously talking about the units of the Roman army that at some point find themselves in a land ruled by somebody else, where the state has evaporated, and they're actually revered within the same Germanic army because of their military tradition, and they lead generations with that set of probably identitary military legacy. That's the interesting aspect of it all. You have the civitates participating to the army. You have catapults, in Clovis armies. You have these Roman militias from the various cities that still work, right? And they will keep working, right? It's basically the same system, just rather modifies itself later. We are essentially discovering, more time goes on, like how much of a greater continuity existed from Roman times, naturally, especially in Southern Europe. But our basic notion is that, I don't know, at some point the Western Roman Empire ends, and so it's over, guys. It's just a completely different story. Let's change book, and it's all different characters. No, they're the same people, right? And not just that, they are like the same systems that largely remain intact, because there is no major destruction that occurs actually in these centuries. And the West retained. I made an entire video a couple of months ago in this direction, like the idea that we think that Latin Germanic West was somehow backward compared to, say, even the Byzantine world. It's really not true. Especially for southwestern Europe, you can see that the essential political and social fundamentals were also just much better than the Byzantine ones to begin with. It was a much more sclerotic system, and it was very well founded for that reason. It was rigid and tough, right, to withstand many blows, but it sort of came at a cost, right, from the way it was managed. And we all know that, say, the Latin Germanic West was much more liberal in a classical sense than the Byzantine system, that really had increasingly headed towards an autocratic direction. There is a lot of Persian influence there as well, but we do not discuss this specifically. The different stories of these Germanic peoples, also as far as we've seen how they ended, have to do with different enemies, right? There are other kingdoms or Germanic peoples that they had to wrestle power with. There are very interesting dynamics over the broader arc. Like, again, the Merovingians are particularly precocious in that sort of control of other countries in particular, and then also the Carolingians basically follow into their steps, as basically also in any other thing. But you have these powers fighting different times against, but also with the Byzantines. This is somehow forgotten. Like, for example, the Franks and the Byzantines at some point allied themselves at the end of the 6th and beginning of the 7th century, tried to destroy the Longobards that resist in the Po Valley in their fortified cities. And there are lots of Longobards from the Byzantine side as well, in the same Italy, but also in the rest of the empire. So you have lots of these war bands going back and forth, and you have, we talked about this in the video about the early medieval mercenaries, the Saxons, quite early on, even though it's apparently lesser known things, they're selling their service as mercenaries. You have, of course, the Visigoths fighting against the Arabs. Later, the same Franks will. So you have quite, again, we've seen the Avars too. They attack northeastern Italy, Merovingian Germany. So the Celts in the French that are sort of infesting. So at some point the Vikings arrive, but it's later compared to our general timeline here. As we said at the beginning, regardless of these interesting differences and generally shared military know-how, right, also from other places, from service abroad, etc., the Romano-Germanic way to conceive and to practice war presents satisfactorily common characters that allow themselves to be studied jointly, at least under this point of view. At least you can't draw the strictly military conclusions of it. And so let's get to the strictly ideological side of the story. It's definitely not the kind of video to space excessively across like all the enormous sort of Romano-Germanic military legacy, the facets of the same. Again, we made so many videos if you are interested, there is a migration era warfare playlist, a Germanic warfare playlist that is the late Roman army one. So there is really a lot to take in consideration. But we have to sum up for the sake of introduction. Imagine you've never heard of that. And so how do you define this? So the strictly Germanic element is a community fundamentally oriented towards war. There is no doubt about this. The Roman world, of course, is much more historically stable, socially stratified. You have like a broader set of civic values, a state, some public authority, a permanent army. Some people in the system make the war, the others work. You don't have the militarization of the entire population. The Germans live in the Barbaricum, and as such they are constantly one step away from being massacred by some neighbor. And they develop almost actually a paranoid attitude that, however, is very effective in strengthening bonds among populations that had previously otherwise not really had much political associationism, right? So the migration era, all these peoples coming, especially from the east, and meet mostly like the Germans that have gradually migrated in the previous centuries towards the Black Sea, that sort of causes this dramatic issues. You know, that the Greutungian Bosphorian kingdom is overrun by the Huns, as far as we understand. Essentially, by the beginning of the 5th century, whoever's not from the has not escaped from the Roman side is under the Huns. From the other, there apparently were interesting steps in intersections and infiltrations in the same Scandinavia military culture. So it's really a very complex picture. There are lots of Iranians that constitute like this avalanche of refugees broken already by the mostly like Turkic powers now sweeping the steppes from the Far East that essentially stiffen the ranks of the Germanic confederacies and essentially blend into them to an extent. Then there are the Slavs as well, but we'll talk about them separately. So in the Germanic society, every able-bodied freeman is a warrior, and there is a great deal of also elevation to freedom on the basis of military service, which would occur through, for example, like a servile performance as a retinue, like the field aid of a Germanic warrior, and this was done to stiffen the ranks, to give like this redeeming power to in fact these lower elements that, however, were selected. It is an incredibly hostile and brutal environment. We know what the Germans thought like, right? If you look at the art, their artifacts in the previous in the first generations after the settlement, they're still like living in a world that is populated by monsters that devour people, that scatter their limbs everywhere. Like it's that again, like think about Grendel, think about the Ouroboros, the general root of evil, right, at the foundations of the world that mirrors like the incredibly turbulent and violent scenario from which these peoples come from. And they're not faring well at all. Like this is a moment of destabilization for which both Romans and Germans or anybody else out there are having it pretty tough, right? It should be pointed out that the same Romans had actually a level of militarization, in a sense, increasingly mirroring that more oligarchic and private culture that at the end of the day, the same Germanic elites in a way or another, both for the migration needs of unity of command and movement and for the same Romanization would acquire, right? But the population, again, the majority of the people works in the fields, and it's able, in fact, to maintain until the state lasted kind of effective Roman military with pretty high standards as well. And most of the shift is at the top, whereby the same Germans essentially settle in places, substituting an evaporated Roman army that they had also contributed to destroy, but fundamentally keeping on like with the same mechanism of the unknown, etc. I already made a video about this, so I don't have to repeat myself, but it's also notorious. So especially in the first generations, the Germans are not just separated from the Romans in a juridical sense, as the conquerors were superior to the conquered, before blending again, in indistinguishable fashion, but they own and spread, in fact, in the rest of the population, with this also general spread of individual liberty to at least a greater extent that had happened in some oligarchic context of late Romanity, depending also where, because as we've seen in Gaul, for example, it's not much the case, right? But still at an elite level, there is something similar. The hit, like the civilizational crash, does impact all the system. It does destabilize, it does decay, it does degenerate, but you have this eminently warlike values that are reinjected into the West by the Germans, reinvigorating the same Latin culture and creating this hybrid that we still recognize as essentially the foundation of, if anything, the modern West. Those really took off in the end. So the entire Germanic society, we've seen it in so many videos. We covered the warrior brotherhoods, the beast warriors, the comitatus, the adopt super arma, the one about sort of the Germanic imperial Catholic miracle. You named it. Really, we talk about the sword in the Romano-Germanic culture. There's so much we've already done, but this is reflecting within the same originary Germanic society that the relations between the social and the military organization are incredibly compact, tight, organic. A free man is de facto a soldier of some sort, or at least a fighter, a warrior, and the king's task, as the one of actually any clan leader that would lead locally, or some duke, the count that would command provincially, is the one to lead these individuals to war, right? This is essentially the concept of the Königtum, right? The king is a provider of conquests, right? It's as if these peoples were a war band by their own. This is something which the same migration triggers. It's something you see since the time of the Cimbri and the Teutonists, right? And there are some interesting passages in, for example, Tacitus' Germany, whereby you see that entire peoples would literally devote themselves as warrior beasts back in the day. The Lugi, for example, that were largely the ancestors of the Vandals, right? They were not necessarily even very Germanic, like they were some sort of Germano-Celto-Slavic blend, right, at the time of the ethnogenesis. And this warband system is basically the entire Indo-European engine historically. We've seen it for lots of other peoples, including back in the day the same Romans, as properly the engine of civilization, right? The only one to select, to epurate, to boost, to strengthen. And so there is a duty of these individuals, but also a privilege to fight. Now, particularly interesting is what I hinted at before, that actually throughout the early Middle Ages, this individual protagonism fades, right? If anything, it's the more successfully Frankish power to foster, like, more similar to what had been like the latifundium system, and this, again, elite that subjugates everything and everyone, whereas probably that sense of civic freedom is most typically evident among the Italian communes in the High Middle Ages, from also an evidently Longobarд legacy. But all of this system is actually blended, it's mixed. I recently made a video about the role of the, let's say, the minor nobility of Europe as the backbone in European armies throughout their entire history, which is basically the fruit of this Romano-Germanic system. And it doesn't matter where it's more balanced towards the Germanic or the Roman, and still in Western Europe is tightly compacted into one, which also becomes a matter of an overall Western awareness definitely existing since these very moments. And then again, there are different dynamics that produce, in fact, especially overall, is after the Carolingian conquests, essentially unique feudalism. You can talk about more sort of Franco-Germanic feudalism in Gaul, or the more, say, Romance feudalism in places like Italy or Spain. But at the end of the day, the essentials of Western European warfare remains the same, and throughout the centuries it actually compacts ever more towards the same direction. The main bulk is definitely post-Carolingian Europe, strictly meant, but this eventually overflows to England, to Sicily, etc. The ancestral meaning of the Herrkönigtum is crucial, because the same idea of royal power, of sacred royalty, is at the basis of this military identity. Like, these are peoples in arms. Like, the kings are elected probably on the tip of the spears, elevated on the shields, right? Still, also in very civilized contexts, like, again, the Longobards kingdom, which is also the only exception I can think of functional elective monarchy, is formally referred to as this. This is the assembly of the freemen in arms that decides who's going to be the next leader, who's going to lead them to victory. All right, and especially, of course, in this earlier era, in the 6th and 7th century, the king is this provider, this guy who stores wealth in order to redistribute it, and through the gift, essentially, of the imperium of the Holy Ghost, to elevate further as a visage, as one who has the capacity to envisage the future by molding the world at his own image in the process, really elevates the rest of his followers that, in fact, are part of his retinue out of sheer free will, as devotion, at least ideally, just because they realize what kind of medium, what a carrier of victory this guy is. And that will essentially define further what a nobleman is compared to from who is not. Right? Technically, every freeman is a nobleman. This is already entailed by the Roman citizenship, like the fact of having served Rome and demonstrating that you can elevate yourself to the standards of the conquerors as a subject, does confer you the right not just to vote, but to properly bear arms, which is what in the system really matters, to differentiate like a man from a human, which is incredibly important. So war, for especially the Germans at the beginning of the era, is a system of life, right? And not just a mean of survival and of expansion. It's really all one. It's like with the Latin motto vivere militare est, that is to say, like, living is really like fighting a war, right? This is a concept that recurs in Western history. I'm writing an article that is actually pointing this out, how alive this was still by the 13th to 14th century. You can find this among probably the Germanic mercenaries of the Minnesänger age. You can find it in Dante, that basically falls out of grace and sin and finds himself in the forest, where he meets with initiation, like the warrior beasts he has to contend the path with, and he enters hell in order to essentially build up, to redeem himself, to reach heaven. I made a video about the Germanic Gefolgschaft recently that is exactly this, the infernal path to heavenly rule, which is an incredibly important concept. It's very Jungian also in nature, and it stems directly from, of course, the mythologies and the actual lifestyle of all these Indo-European people, right? Needless to say, and I explained this also, for example, commenting on the 4th century BC Roman juridical institutional system, like basing it on the Indo-European etymologies of the same terms of the offices of the magistracies, etc., that all public life stemmed from, in European tradition, from that militarization of the same. And so by the 6th century you can find, also unfortunately in a time in which we can document this much better than in the ancient ones for many peoples, and that's why the Germans are such a privileged group. Like, we can study, like as we are privileged to have had people who would write extensively about them throughout all these centuries of civilization, that for whom even the civil manifestations of public life easily take on a military aspect, right? The sense of being, like, again, somebody worth of faith, right? Having to, with all this life was very much public and oral, and valid in that also juridical dimension, right? Everything is the manifestation of this divine glory achieved in arms. For example, the Frankish Chilperic gives his daughter in marriage to the king of the Visigoths, Recared. Her name is Rigond, providing her with a following of 4,000 warriors. Naturally, you can make all these are very early ages. Like, we don't even think that they would mobilize 4,000 warriors for such a thing. But the idea that this was plausible in the sources, and that it, of course, was understood in its original meaning, right, of sending what was essentially an extension of manly rule, right, even in a biological sense, like vessel of life, and this possession. Like, women did not really have they didn't have a juridical autonomy. That prize, right, was also the Visigothic king's one, in this sense, as a recognition of his nobility, and so, like, the worthiness of the connection at such high international level of power, right? This is incredibly important. The dynastic ties are also the mean through which Europeans at this point recognize each other's empire. Bertwald, the master of palace of the Burgundian kingdom, was at some point tasked by the Frankish king to inspect the fishi, that is to say the tax lands, right, the domain along the Seine, and for this task he brings with himself 400 soldiers. And here the reason is also not just that symbolical. Of course, like in the case of the princess, she needed an escort, right, which makes a lot of sense. And here, essentially, an official of the Merovingian Empire has to claim part of this domanial lands back with force, because they would have been usurped by someone. So these 400 soldiers would have been instrumental to it. There have been scholars who claimed that the civilization rising from the great migrations was one of war and of aggression. But I don't think it's correct to single it out in this way. Of course, the Roman one had been definitely war and aggression, expansionism. The Germans were, if anything, in the quite delicate position of having to actually preserve civilization from the ruins of the Roman world that was still in part functional, and therefore providing them with great advantages in governance and territorial control. And so, if anything, you have a very, I would stress, the intelligence of the Germanic peoples, and the actual success of their work over the centuries in probably the balance that they managed to achieve, right? Maintaining, because this is the state from which we stem from, like maintaining a sense of public order, of concentrated power, but at the same time leaving enough liberty and recognizing individual potential. That was something that, especially in the aftermath of a civilizational collapse, was not to be given for granted. That especially the Franks and the papacy worked like crazy in order to fix. Think about all the Gaelic missionaries, the general goodwill that the other Romano-Germanic or even just Germanic rulers displayed in cooperating this great enterprise that held by respecting the various communities within the system at large. This is typical also of the later feudalism, like in the 12th and 13th century. You have a massive expansion of power in the West. I made a video about this recently as well. But the particularity of the West, unlike in the Byzantine world, is that this growth did not hamper the development of local autonomies. On the contrary, different communities developed in parallel and to support willingly the development of greater powers. This is, for example, a unitary push that Islam does not have. We could digress on the role properly of the church or the priesthood in the West that is very often misunderstood to the point of saying it should have not existed because otherwise everything would have succeeded. The church is the consequence of a new order of nature that humanity had sort of chosen for itself, for which nobody could simply hold by themselves like the plenitude of imperial power, and so there had to be this cooperation between the sort of the temporal and the spiritual side of the story to use effectively check and balancements for both. And the West is by far the most successful system in this regard, and there is, especially at this point in early medieval times, a much greater orthodoxy at all levels compared to the Byzantine Empire that is flirting with the monophysites, with different the monothelites, etc., in order just to salvage parts of the empire in the Levant that were essentially trying to detach themselves from the centralistic control of Constantinople. The Byzantine emperors treat the papacy brutally, and at that point you find even namely Arian powers that support the papacy and that especially do so in recognizing the validity of the most obvious Catholic positions that the pontiff was criticizing Constantinople for displaying, as they would prove further later with their full Catholicization in the 7th century. Basically, well, the system is settled. That they were incredibly sort of balanced and well disposed and sort of provided with common sense and reason. This I could not stress how successful the Latin Germanic connubium really was at all levels. It's something simply incredible, and we do not emphasize it in our school books enough, right? We have sort of the catastrophistic image what was going on, this brutality, the thing, but say harnessing and mastering violence is a civilizational virtue, right? The greater civilizations are the most powerful ones. There is no doubt whatsoever. The ones who know how to make war better, to actually win one, right? And not to just being wishful thinkers. And considering, in fact, this notion also of different enemies and aggressions, etc. Like Europe was not really on the verge of collapsing at any given moment. We're very tough times, but if you look at what these Romano-Germanic powers do, is resisting, is sitting there and realizing we do not even need, like at this point, like an over expansion or something that goes beyond like the construction of some internal power and interconnection with other states, because we do actually have a pretty good idea of what is going on internationally. And these other powers are just trying to, again, like the primordial snake, trying to root, like to rot our roots, and harassing us in that way. But at some point we will strike back, and at that point, who was the stronger will be even evident. It's not a matter of leaving the initiative to the enemy, simply taking on the offensive. And I think it's, especially during the 10th, the 11th century, like such a self-evident dynamic that I don't know what we really want more, like from the other sides. You got to give to the Byzantines their due. Of course, they were a great military, a great state, a great system. They managed to re-expand themselves. They had good fundamentals, right? But the vibrancy and expansional capacity that the West will display, it is truly exceptional. It is truly something which you do not witness elsewhere, and especially that it has the awareness to act upon it. There's not simply like a place advantage by some distance from the steppe, right? We're pretty strong attacks from the same steppe war during the migration era, that however were not really threatening the bulk of that sedentary European civilization as a whole. On the contrary, like especially in the recent video I made commenting on the historian's craft, like one interesting aspect that I like of the many that I pointed out among the others is that Rome as the center of two halves of the empire lives on exactly in that way, right? By the 11th, the 12th century, the papacy is clearly thinking to have a unitary Roman empire under its control, right, in the east and in the west. And if you look at the substance of European civilization in a broader sense, both properly in continental Europe and in the Mediterranean, there is no doubt that the civilization was incredibly compact and incredibly courageous and resistant and expansive, and mostly from the Latin Germanic end. The omnipresence of war during the migration era Germanic mentality is of course revealed by the Germanic onomastics, right? That in the 7th century triumphs, especially in Gaul, among some descendants of the Gallo-Romans. It would be extremely interesting to make a history of this, because different countries sort of have it in different ways, right? And some names eventually will become more famous than others. It would be different influences from different countries as well. Also in Europe, indeed, we share that basis. I, for example, have a Germanic surname that literally stems from the bear warrior. And in my case, it's probably of Frankish origin, right? And this is beautiful because in many ways, of course, it was also Norse origin, and simply because there is an area of the bear, for example, like other countries, I don't know, the Longobards, that are relatively also Central Europe and Northern European in origins, made a video on that, did not much have the bear in their onomastics. They had the wolf, because the steppe had been that sort of more impacting. Like the Franks import names like Bernard, for example, in Italy, and in other parts of, say, of the West. And you can literally trace this chronology among the various peoples. There are, in fact, some inusitated Germanic names that today we don't even, in fact, that are not common, that nobody uses anymore. There are many, like also in the other, I don't know, Roman or Hellenic or Jewish onomastics. For example, my name is Hellenic. My second name, which is technically the Christian name, that's how I was baptized, but I don't have it on my ID for my country, is Jewish, and my surname is Germanic. And so it's incredibly important for me just to look at this perspective of the story, because you realize that our names all have a specific history and a specific origin. They all fit mostly that Catholic sense of divine transfiguration, right? For example, like my Hellenic name is connected to another, well, I can't tell you like that because otherwise you would guess my name, but it's definitely connected with that Uranian and chthonic sort of transfigurational process. My same Jewish name, to be fair, is like grace of God, and my Germanic name is also, again, this one connected to the bear, to the warrior beast, the berserker fundamentally. And so you have all this shading, and that when you look at the etymology of, you realize that basically shares pretty much like the same origin, the same meaning. For example, Baldric, right? I don't know how many people are called Baldric today. I can think of Baldwin, I can think of other, say, etymologies connected with this also as a termination. Bold as a termination, for example, Arcimbold, like even though it's not Archibald, right? That would be there, but it's exactly from there. Like Bald in Germanic is of course bold in English as well, of course, in the same Germanic language with slight modification. So Baldric comes from the bold, and Rick, which is also the etymology of the entire sense of power of the same Reich, and so this general wealth and power, right? It means literally powerful in many ways. So to be prosper in that, because these are all military names, right? The onomastics has all a specific military meaning, and this is very true for the Germanic names. You are powerful because you have been bold in war, and so you have been rewarded with the imperium. That's the etymology. Richard comes from Rick Hart, so the sense you have the inversion in the causal connection. They could compose it really many ways, but essentially Hart stands for, in part from bold, yes, but in the sense of also pretty stout, resistant, bulky, strong, etc. So you're prosper because you are that perennially strong, right? These perennialism appears in so many traditional names that we do not realize in that key. Think about Hermann, right? In different European languages, you have, Armando, right? In Spanish, or Hermano in Italian. And this, of course, comes from Herriman, so the man of the army, right? The guy who actually goes to war because he belongs to the Heer, right? To the army proper, to the armed community of freemen, right? This is technically, even though, for example, the etymology of German is unknown, it's likely this one, right? How did the Germans call themselves? Like Hermannen, because literally or German, there is the etymology connected with Ger, that is the Lanks, for example. And so it's basically the same. So it's the man of the army, but is also spearman in the most ancestral meaning of the term. Gerd, the Gungnir, like the famous Lanks of Odin, is contained in Roger, right? Because the name comes from Ortgar, which means Hort stands for glorious, famous, like somebody who had achieved victory in arms, of course, had been blessed with the Holy Ghost, and Ger, of course, that stands for Langs. So you can interpret it as, the guy is the Langs, so the alter ego of the warrior, just like, again, the Excalibur, the Durandal, they're literally the soul of the warrior. And we explain it, we will keep explaining it in other videos on this support that we will make. Or that basically you had, just by consequence, like this, it's the Langs was glorious, so it's your Langs has already killed so many enemies, has allowed you to win in so many battles, and so since it's nothing but your alter ego, you are the guy who has received this glory. It's the same thing. William, of course, comes from Wilhelm, which is a combination of will and helm, apparently, which is sort of, I love this name personally. I would like to call my future son William, but I don't deny that the etymology is a bit more disappointing. It's sort of more material in a way, but of course also the helm was considered as that alter ego of the warrior. Think about the crests with like the ensigns, the arms of the warrior on it. This is something we have sort of forgotten a little bit. It was actually common also during the migration era, even though there is sort of slightly less evidence for this, but there are some cases in which the helm was the projection of something greater. The Vikings did have horns, in spite of, the meme that it would be a myth. Like there were many more crests, especially for the leaders, than we think. Then Gerhard, of course, this is strong Langs. Augir, and again there are different ways you can pronounce it here. I stress the Germanic root, but say Auger, I think in French is also a name, and this would come from Adel, which naturally means noble, and Ger, in fact, so noble Langs. Gertrud, this is the interesting part, as we've seen before, also women have militarized names. I made a video about the Valkyries, and of course these are the symbols of the ancillary function that woman has to have in the virile divine transfiguration, as being all one with the man, and that has to tame this more Dionysian fury of the chthonic world into the heavenly maiden that will transport him to heaven jointly, as she is transfigured, the Filcia, the Valkyrie again. And so Gertrud comes from Ger as well, so Langs, and Trudis. This is also, think about the Frankish trustis, right? It is that you have to trust these people in a sort of military sense. And so trust is not just trust, but security in that sense. The sense these guys are bonding through, like it's the Brotherhood of Warriors tied connection in the war band, right? And so all these people have in common, you see here, the same Langs itself, that could be like the leader, like it's the symbol of the Roman fasces, for example, right? All these Langses together, they make a bundle, and they're able to strike more powerfully, which is also like the connection in the Latin symbology of the fasces, of course, of the northern axe, right? The same Italic ancestors bore. Mathilde, mashed hilt, right? Which means like, powerful for war. So a hell of a name, battle name. Seeburg, which comes from Sieg, which is victory, and Burg is in the sense that stands for defense, but in a sort of counter-offensive ideal, like of defense of protection of some sort, and it was connected with this towering position. For example, the Burgunds were coming from highlands in their etymology, so a bit like the Highlanders, like victorious Highlanders or something like that, because they were themselves fortresses. They were the same ranks of these warriors were like a fortress. Now, the famous Louis, right? So Ludwig, Ludovico, Luigi, etc., comes from Chlodoved, right? Chlodovicus, that is fighting for glory, right? Just think about Clovis having this name, founding basically the entire Merovingian enterprise, and so the Frankish power at large, coming from this etymology, spreading the name all over Western Europe, fighting for glory. Like, this is the doctrine of self-sacrifice in holy combat, which is incredible. This is what the Saint Clovis did, devoting himself during the Battle of Tolbiac to the Christian god in order to obtain victory. So it's such an insane. And consider, of course, that all these names were very much like cognomina. They were nicknames originally. Like, the individuals did not necessarily call themselves like that. They acquired this name once they had covered themselves in glory, and they had been proven. They had become men after the military initiation, and therefore acquired like a particular skill, a particular characteristic through the way that their imperium had manifested. So Clovis actually would have stamped, at least it's particularly appropriate for that ruler, right? You have Lothair, which is Clotaire, that is, Ari stands for noble or famous. It's the same etymology we've seen before of Hermann, to an extent. It's Aryan too, like the idea of nobleman. So, but it's synonymous with army as well. So cloth is the celebrity, is this clarity, right? The same Latin etymology in Latin, for example. And so somebody who has become famous through his military deeds. Herbert, that is Caribert, essentially brilliant for war, right? For this military capacity and offense defense, like properly something that stands out. Guntram comes from Gundkram, which is literally battle crow, the symbol of Odin himself. Bear it in mind, because in the Germanic world, like this that had lived at the margins of the greater Roman Empire, that the countercultural symbol was the chthonic necrophagus crow, as opposed to the eagle, right? So, but in many ways, it was the same animal that had to transfigure, like the dark soul into the golden one through struggle and victory. So that's this angelic and etheric symbolism that you find in the same Saint Michael that, say, the Normans or the Longobards were literally obsessed with. You find pretty much everywhere. We'll have really to come back on these topics because it's so important, so powerful, and so relevant. Clothild's Battle of Glory, Brunhild's Battle Cuirass, literally, from the Brunia, literally. Think about the Carolingian Brunia, the cuirass of this magnificent masters of war on horseback, right? And incarnating those griffins, like this heroes, they're really spreading their wings as they charge against the enemy and flying to heaven because of their accomplishment, detaching from the earth in the process. And so this is so important. You find a lot of Neo-Latin words, of course, coming from the Germanic, right? This is so obvious. For example, guerre, that comes from verra, and it's a sense of sort of probably warring in the... Because the Latins had the bellum, which was almost like an Apollonian ideal of the pure clash of will. Verra is instead this containing in its semantics this more prolonged, relentless, almost feud-based struggle of raids and brutality and more. Guard comes in the Neo-Latin to ambushes, like there are different marshal, seneschal, these were at least some proper military titles. Blesser, for example, in French, like to wound comes from Germanic, to spy, to furbish. Navrer, which means to tear apart. Adouber, which means to dub, a knight. The stock, the helm, the targe, the hauberk. I made a video about the coat of mail, if anything. We explained there a bit of the metallurgic history in the Romano-Celto-Germanic tradition. The same stirrup, the spur, the standard, the banner, the gonfalon, these are all Germanic words in origin, and as you understand, they're very loaded. They're not just technical military terms, they're loaded with almost like a fulgurating imagery behind them. This is what, just by spelling, you could see, you could envision, right? I'm writing, it's incredible how I'm writing exactly about this stuff in the Imperial Catholic tradition, and how really these symbols all incarnated that almost divine and in fact also infernal visions that from a battlefield can arise. So this is an important side of the story, a way you can read it. In other videos we have also observed how one of the characteristics of the new forms of war stemming from the migration era consists in the fracture, apparently a radical one that instead is really not, in fact, in relation to the Roman military system. This was based, as we observe, on the presence of a permanent army formed by professional soldiers, upkept through a regular leverage of say a regular contribution in nature or in money that was loaded on the rest of the population, right? Because the Mediterranean had much more surplus, but also the elites softened up more, so the Germans were much hungrier and angrier in that regard, and so the entire population contributed to the military effort, because largely, if they hadn't, they would have simply fallen from a day to another under somebody else. And this is also why they knocked each other out and why they toughened up, so that, as you know, in late antiquity, the Roman military, aside from the fact that it has Romanized an enormous amount of Germans that come to serve in the Roman army from the outer side and make a living as Roman soldiers, to come back, like finishing their days as veterans in the same Germany. And there is a lot of cross interaction there between, again, think about the Germanic corporis custodes of the imperial bodyguard, etc. Like an enormous contact. Like we think like the Romans were from one side and the Germans from the other. These peoples had always been in contact with each other since ever. Right? Notoriously, the Etruscans had intense relations with Scandinavia, with Germany. You can imagine during the Roman Empire, we have this paranoid mentality by which, I don't know, there's the Roman Empire that is a universe all on its own, and like in 19th century Victorian political maps, we see like a line, and from the other side it's another thing, right? It's not like there weren't differences, of course there are also massive ones, but the contacts, the awareness, the exchanges were incredibly strong. But as we just said, the Roman army is reached by the Germans themselves, because also within this Germanic confederacy you have an elite that is sort of more elite, where you have in the 6th century already the prevalence of cavalry over infantry. By the mid-6th century it's evident there, but it's also fruit and part of the collapse of the system, and also in the sedentarization of the Germans themselves at a point. So that there is a sort of stratification in military capacity, right? So that in the Roman army there were sort of more elite units compared to a larger amount of levies. So it was actually the case from the Germanic side. It basically equate themselves by the 6th century. Because otherwise Rome had sort of the higher quality. But these Germans have reached that, right? And so they are essentially equivalent to one another. I made different videos about the Strategicon, including the one talking about the so-called blonde-haired peoples that are basically the Germans. And you realize there that it's not like the Byzantines thought too highly of them, and there are all some, considerations to make. I don't have the time today, but they recognize this sense of this great capacity that the Germans had, especially in cavalry charges. So they charge as if they were the only people in the world to have courage, and actually they were better horsemen than the average Germanic one out there, especially, the Avars or something. But there we're talking the extreme, that sense that of admiration that the Byzantines had towards the Germans at a point is the same Anna Komnena has towards the Franks during the First Crusade. It's not they had changed too much, right? But now they were also incredibly more efficient military machines, thanks to, in fact, that the same Romanization and Christianization and feudalization and further. But the Germanic element is really key to it, right? You can't eliminate it. It's the moral one. It's the one that is pumped pneumatically in this sort of exhausted Latin body that revives it in like body and soul, right, in a complementary fashion. The Germans, before settling in the Roman Empire, living in the Barbaricum, would simply live off the land in a way or another. In many ways, they were sedentary, especially up to the 2nd century. They mostly lived off of agriculture. But the migration era brings them to be much more on the move, so that they're also often called semi-nomadic, to an extent differentiating them from probably the nomadic people, so like the Huns, the Avars, etc. And great part of this, of course, they were still very sedentary in many ways. I mean, if you look at the migrations, it's not like they were permanently in motion for centuries. Like, even if they did, we're talking about like different clans moving from here and there, settling in one place next to another, not really the entire people moving. But when they moved, indeed, that they also lived a bit more predatory, also settling on different, say, on lands populated by more sedentary people. Speak about, the Proto-Slavs or other, the same Romanized or the Romano-Celtic populations. Like, still this idea of seigneury is pretty much ingrained in the sense of movement, especially when the German nobility gets a lot of Irano-Hunnic influence, right? The steppes really autocratize a lot these systems. The Romans contribute. It's basically the Romans that create some of these peoples. I mean, the Visigoths were essentially created as the Roman army of Illyricum, conferred properly, like they were given a king, and so they are a Roman creation. Because otherwise, they weren't kings really as we intend them in the Germanic world, at least in that sense of single king for a single nation of people. Now they can fundamentally also select out of the broader Germanic world. Naturally, by moving, they had already sort of enucleated each other depending on the various events that had gone through during the movement, the different enemies and so on. But in many ways, there is a lot of similarity already before the final settlement between the Romans and the Germans from a military point of view. All right. What happens in practice is that gradually the civil and military bureaucracy stemming from the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine largely deteriorate, right? There were archives, there were, written documents, and it's not like this dies out. Again, the Latin Germanic West is not a return to tribalism or to savagery. It is, on the contrary, like the installation of some refreshing military power at the top in the elites and some sort of more action-based political system in a pretty tumultuous reality still that, again, where the system has taken a big blow and there are cultural divides and shortcomings and so on, further wars. Some systems are destroyed, say, by Byzantines or by other Germanic peoples. But overall, like especially in the West, the Latin substratum, the Romance society and administration remains, right? And this lives on during the Romano-Germanic rule, because there is a kingdom now, there is a territoriality, there are edicts, the Germans begin to legislate in Latin. There is an evident direction they're taking there to make things work and to preserve as much as they could. And that's basically, again, a very successful enterprise in the long run. The Roman army had tried to stem these forces from the other side. We don't have time to explain now in this video. This is just a broader reference to how things had occurred. Again, the same Roman army, in many ways, regardless of the ties it could have at a provincial level, had mobile armies, usurpers, generals going back and forth. So it's not like the Romans were as exotic as the Germans in that case, but again, every province had a sort of a different history, and so when the Germans arrive, they substitute themselves to that sort of either power vacuum, like, I don't know, when the Romans leave Britain, for example, or they actually settle in places that the Romans gave to them, exactly because the local system was in part exhausted, also from a demographic point of view, so that literally finding levies had been difficult. So many Germans had been settled, for example, down as prisoners of war in the previous centuries on the frontiers. And many areas had part on the outskirts of the empire had already been Germanized. That's also how the Federati in general come out, except they are now, as Federati, properly free nations that are contracting an alliance and a settlement with Rome as peers, right? And so you can see this shift. You can see, especially northern Gaul, Britain being taken over. At some point, you have these pockets of the Visigoths, the Vandals, etc., in other parts of the West. Finally, you have entire kingdoms given to, say, the Ostrogoths in Italy itself. And so, again, you know the story in many ways. You know how this more or less happened. And the sense here being that passage in part with the erosion of public authority, the general instability, the endemic and economic collapse. Of course, that idea that the majority of the population could simply live in a latifundium and pay for an elite largely is shattered. This is especially true for Britain and Italy. It is less true for Gaul and Spain for different reasons. In Italy, there is, for example, the Gothic War that shatters properly the entire social substratum. So when the Longobards arrive, the Italians themselves do not really quite have the latifundium in a unitary way. And this helps terribly the Longobards to establish a public and civil system, because now also the average Roman is sort of freer than before, and basically everybody living in the Longobard-controlled areas of the peninsula become Longobard within a couple of generations or so. In Britain, it's also brutal. There is, after the Romans leave, an internal revolt of some sort. I made a video about the Arthurian army organization that explains this a little bit. Instead, Gaul and Spain, yes, are ravaged at some point by different conquerors, say by different invaders, but the conquerors mostly maintain the system locally. They do not need to destroy, to loot something if they're gonna stay. The Vandals, for example, make a mess in southern Spain because they know they have to cross the Gibraltar Strait into Africa, and eventually they end up in Roman Africa, today's Tunisia, roughly. And so in that case, they would damage some local. But largely, right, they are tidy. Even Alaric's sack of Rome was pretty, like, there weren't necessary, distractions. Like, Alaric cared extremely. Like, by the way, these Germans were incredibly, careful not to mess up with Rome, also in a divine sense. They knew that this was the holy city, it was the center of the world, and they were extremely careful of not triggering divine power. The same Arian Theodoric, one of the greatest heroes of the Germanic epos, after killing Odoacer, which is recounted in all these stories, sang all over the Romano-Germanic world. This is very interesting to see. There is a literary self-awareness from the 6th century that properly defines like the Germanicity, at least of the elites, as a cross-national phenomenon. Goes to Rome to pay homage to the Pope, even as an Arian ruler, because obviously you couldn't do without Catholic power, and whichever, say, the reasons for Arianism, we will explain better in another video. There is so much proto-Protestantism in Arianism, and no surprise that because of the temper of the times, and especially the riches of the West, the power that this came with, like, these peoples all became Catholic and Arianism disappeared, even though these were actually the rulers, right? This is not just because, of course, most of these lands were of ancient Catholicism, say of ancient Christianity, but of ancient Catholicism as well, which people do not understand. If people knew the difference between Christianity and Catholicism, and not Catholicism just as a branch of Christianity in the conventional modern sense, history would be so easier to understand. And they just don't even make the effort, right? So, as a consequence of the Germanic settlement, there is some pacification necessity that has to sort of salvage the broader political cohesion. And so, after centuries of de facto demilitarization of the average person in the Roman world, that did not need that because the system allowed for that to simply be the mainstay and actually make it more stable, the Germans reintegrate this practice exactly because they don't have like a powerful state like the Roman one anymore. They are capillarily settled, and just the rest of the population soon becomes juridically Germanic. And as a consequence, bearing arms becomes again part of daily life, of a common sight. Violence, of course, in an anti, say, social sense, was considered illegal. But of course, you couldn't achieve peace without bearing arms and deterring this, and knowing how to use them. And so, being an elite, being a herman, an Ariman, a nobleman, in order to know where to use that violence in order to make things orderly again. Naturally, this society, the Romano-Germanic world, is more violent than, say, at a at an individual level than, say, what was the previous one and also the later one. However, organized violence had been and would be later more destructive to an extent. So it was a matter of how to handle this imperium once again, and that spread of arms back into Western Europe at a sort of political, juridical level was the continuity in say the safeguard of the system, right, and reinjecting this sense of responsibility from the side of the individual that bears arms as a freeman. Now, in a world that has sort of less authority on top, that collectively you're working like to repristinate, and that must pass through this more uniform militarization, as long as that can be handled. And in fact, there are also many laws trying to regulate how to use arms, etc., in this system, but showing that, of course, this was overall accepted, right? Was overall considered necessary and not avoidable, right? So there are so many different videos we could make. It's not easy to simply just digress on every single topic. Nevertheless, it's important to make these introductions to the world, because sometimes people have maybe more interest in an overview before getting sort of into the depths of the wall. If I look at my playlists on the topic, definitely there is a lot we've made so far. I can look at the Germanic playlist. I think Germanic warfare even just 41 videos. Well, this is exactly what I hoped at some point in Schwerpunkt's history we would get there. And there is definitely so much, like, just to talk about. And yeah, because sometimes we don't even talk about these topics. We don't realize how significant they are and how much is there to do, to discuss. The Germanic Gefolgschaft, Comitatus, Tricamerum, the Hörgerät, the Danes, the Longbard Army, the Celtic metallurgical legacy in the Romano-Germanic world. This includes also ancient stuff, but from saviors to outlaws, the downfall of the Berserkers and the Ulfadnars. Yeah, there's really a lot of stuff, and I'm glad that we covered all these topics at a point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.